Great. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for being here Saturday at 9:30 in the morning and being in this room instead of the other two rooms. I was laughing at not laughing, it's sort of a wry laughter this morning. It's sort of like, impunity's over there. We got mis and disinformation over here. So, it's just a barrel of laughs in these days for journalists. So to keep with that sort of dark theme, we are here to talk about, the title of this is, What Can Journalists Do About Mis and Disinformation? We can sort of all go home in a minute because the answer is we can't fix it. So thank you for joining us. And no, I'm kidding. Sorry, I'm a little punchy this morning. But let me just do a little bit of a setup, which is, yes, of course, let's just state the obvious. We can't fix it. And anybody that thinks that they can, and Dean Baquet, if you heard him speak yesterday morning, referred to this too, they're either making it up or they're lying. You saw, I wasn't here, but I heard the opening panel with Sally Busby and Michael Slackman. For the opening session also seemed at a loss of what to do. A lot of really, really smart people have been trying to crack this code. But we're going to succeed now. We're going to solve it all in the next, we have about 50 minutes. When we look at the title of this panel, again, what can journalists do about mis and disinformation? One of the things, besides the sort of existential futility of really trying to solve it, the other complication is that what do we even mean when we talk about the impact of mis and disinformation? Are we talking about, are we here to talk about what can we do about reporting on, say, the President of the United States and the tens of millions of people who listen to him when he says that he won the 2020 election when he didn't? And what does that mean in terms of how we report? Do we mean what can we do about sort of the bad faith, I will call it bad faith media that's drowning out reality-based, evidence-based information that all of us in this room, we're here because that's what we believe in. What can we do about the global and mis and disinformation machine that is Facebook and some of the other platforms? What can we do about the erosion of trust in news? What can we do about the personal attacks on journalists that have made, for so many journalists, our lives a living hell? There is a lot to unpack here, and it is very much a global crisis. But on that grim note, let's cheer ourselves up a little bit, because we do have really a stellar group here, including on the screen, who are in all their various ways contributing to the canon of fixes that together will help us sort of chip away at the crisis of our information disorder. So from them all the way to my left, Jeff Horwitz is the technology reporter for the Wall Street Journal, based in the Bay Area. He covers Facebook's business and its impact on the world, which we definitely are going to talk about. Next to him is Metta Dharmasaputra. Hopefully I said that right. He's the co-founder and CEO of Katadata, an online news media data and research company focused on economic and business issues in Indonesia. Then Drew, oh God, I forgot to ask you how to pronounce your name. Menaker. God damn, if I just guessed it, I would have gotten it right. Drew Menaker is the chief operating officer at PEN America, the human rights organization, of course, that is defending and celebrating the freedom to write. And with us from Kenya is Asha Mwilu, who she is the founder and managing partner of Debunk Media. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for being here. So Drew, I'm going to begin with you because PEN America recently did a survey of over 1,000 journalists and newsrooms that really shed a lot of light on the impact of disinformation and what kind of impact it's having on journalists and on news organizations, professionally, organizationally, and personally. So I want you to sort of just set the stage here by sharing some of that data.
Sure, thank you, Vivian. As mentioned, we did set out to try to find out what was going on in newsrooms, how journalists and their practice was changing as a result of this onslaught. And I have to say, I think we hit a nerve. If anyone's tried to do a survey of professionals, they don't know. Getting 1,000 responses was pretty encouraging in a certain way, in the sense of how engaged people were, and discouraging about how sensitive and concerned people are. And by people, I mean reporters, editors. We had responses from across the country of people at varying stages of their careers, at different kinds of community, city, regional, and national outlets, and a reasonably diverse response in terms of other sort of demographic, geographic, and similar factors. So we were pretty secure in the sense that we had gotten quite a broad view of what was going on. And before I get into some of our numbers, I will say some of the words that people used, which were like flood, drowning, deluge, waves, panic. They talked a lot about being overwhelmed, frustrated, even scared. They talked about how coping with this was draining resources off the rest of the newsroom, off of what they would consider to be their real work. And of course, this was all going on in a context of reduced staff and budgets. It was requiring new skills and processes that weren't in place yet. And in a context in which they were finding their readers and listeners and other audiences to be increasingly confused and really distrustful. So just to give you some of our top line findings, first, as you can imagine, almost all the respondents thought that disinformation is a major problem for journalism, for the practice of journalism. We really wanted to look at what it meant inside the newsroom among professionals. And 81% of the people who responded called it a very serious problem. 75% said they deal with disinformation professionally on a regular basis. And 61% of those people said they did it regularly, and 15% said it was almost an everyday factor. Only 8% said that detecting and addressing disinformation was anything less than an important problem, and 40% said that it was really an urgent task. So more than 90% of the people who responded, the reporters and editors, said that they had made one or more changes in how they practiced journalism as a result of all this. 66% said they were spending more time actively debunking disinformation. 59% said they had reported intentional efforts to be more transparent about their decisions, to talk more about their methods, their sources to their audiences. So those are, you might say, proactive responses. I have to say that 17% of the journalists who responded said they had avoided doing stories that they were interested in doing because they feared a backlash that would attempt to discredit them professionally or the reporting that they were doing as fake. And 11%, 1 in 10, said they had unintentionally reported disinformation themselves. So those are real numbers. But I think even one of the more striking things about our findings was how the journalists felt that they did not have the specialized skills or the newsroom support systems to respond adequately to this crisis. Only 30% of the journalists said their news outlet had generally effective processes in place, but 40% said they had no organization-wide approach to coping with disinformation. We asked about 8 different steps that journalists could feasibly take, or newsroom leaders could take, to cope with disinformation in the daily practice of journalism. And that included training on how to report on disinformation. That included putting systems in place to respond quickly. It included increased diversity in newsrooms to be able to reach into communities that are targeted by disinformation particularly, and those kinds of ideas. 1 in 3 of the respondents said that their newsroom had not taken a single one of those 8 steps. And just in closing on that scene setting, I would say that journalists complain a lot, and but the tone of this response was not that there was a want of care or a want of concern on the part of the leaders in the newsrooms. It was more about I mean, obviously there were people who felt that you know, sort of the personal toll on journalists maybe wasn't being fully addressed or recognized, or that, you know, that there were inadequate outreach into communities. But mostly people just talked about how impossibly complicated, what a fast-moving target this was. They didn't really feel that people weren't trying in their newsrooms. They felt like it was just very hard to figure out what to do and to get these kinds of new processes and so forth in place. Also, to answer kind of the complicated questions of how you actually go about doing this, you know, the sort of amplification versus ignoring and carrying on kind of questions, and you know, sort of the final despairing note about whether it was possible even to reach some quadrant of their audience. So that's kind of what we found.
And this was a global.
No, this was
the U.S. only.
Only, yes.
I have to say, I mean, there's a lot of really dispiriting, to say the least, data, but I think the most chilling of all of the statistics you laid out is that 17%, that's almost 1 in 5 respondents said that they chose not to report a story, presumably a legitimate story, because they didn't want to deal with the backlash. That is horrifying. Because yes, because yes, even though it may be hard, there are some people we can't reach. If we're not doing the reporting, then we certainly won't reach them. I want to widen, thank you, we'll come back to you in a few minutes, but I want to sort of broaden the aperture here and look at this from a global perspective and an actual real life case study on the ground of mis and disinformation. Asha, I'm going to turn to you. So in the recent Kenyan elections, and the aftermath of the elections are a fascinating case study in how the lack of trust in media creates a breeding ground for mis and disinformation. So tell us what happened and how you engaged.
Thank you, Vivian, and hello to everyone. Sorry I couldn't make it to New York. But just listening to Drew, I can say that first and foremost, as a journalist, I really relate to Pan American Survey. I do feel like most of the time we're dealing with this flurry of misinfo, disinfo, propaganda, and that makes it really hard to do what we feel that we need to do, which is report on the news, report on facts, report on truth. This was certainly the case, not just this year. We had an election in Kenya a month ago, but it's the build up to the election. So Kenya is a really interesting case study when it comes to misinfo and disinfo. It started back in 2013 when we had a presidential candidate and their running mate who had cases at the International Criminal Court against them. And so what they did was that they allegedly hired the services of Cambridge Analytica, who, of course, you know, very infamous company, and what they did in the world, many case studies have been quoted. And they hired Cambridge Analytica to sort of like help them run their campaign. And that was the first time that Kenya experienced this sort of like targeted misinformation or very well calculated disinformation campaigns that were geared towards influencing election outcome. What happened after the 2013 case is that digital media, social media, sort of became like a point of interest for most politicians. So we had an election in 2017 and then this election in 2022. The last 5 years particularly, what politicians did was that they perfected the art of using social media for their campaigns, just like in many parts of the world. But this time, every single politician, from the presidential candidates down to the very local levels, because Kenya usually has one big election for all elective positions, 6 elective positions to be precise. And you would have a politician at a very granular local level hiring teams and paying them between $800 and $10,000 to sort of like, and these are teams of what they call influencers or bloggers, to whip sentiments about them or about their rivals. So one key thing to note is that this is usually a secret affair. So you don't know what these teams are and who comprises of it. But most of the time you find that there's a lot of fake and manipulated content, ranging from photoshopped campaign rallies, which shows exaggerated crowds that a politician had in their rally, to fake endorsements that, hey, look, this politician endorsed me, or this big public figure endorsed my campaign. But what we noticed this time, this is mainly like on Facebook and on WhatsApp. These are two of the biggest platforms that are used in most African countries. Then down to Twitter. But in 2022 in Kenya, something very interesting happened, where we saw TikTok now becoming one of those social media apps that was used not just for disinformation campaigns, but very polarizing content that was going even to divide people on tribal, on ethnic lines, on religious lines. So what we did in Kenya was pretty reactive, just like Drew has mentioned, from the responses that we've had from our colleagues in the US. It was very reactive. You have this flurry of misinfo and disinfo, of propaganda, and really of ampliganda, where even bots would be used. So I think we got into the response really late, but a couple of us who work in the independent media space in Kenya got together and said, hey, it's really hard to counter misinfo and disinfo as individuals. So let's look at what Verificado did in Mexico. Come together, create a collective, and sort of like amplify each other's work, so that you're sort of like matching up to just the amount of misinfo that's going out. And so we formed this collective called Fumbua Collective. We're able to rope in mainstream media players. We're able to rope in civil society players. We were able to speak to some of the platforms, the ones that could give us audience, Facebook, Twitter, just to see what they can do to also counter the misinfo that was going on in their platforms. But to be honest, we haven't really done a lot of research as to how influential or whether this worked, whether having this collective where we could fact check and amplify each other's work, whether this had any impact, because at the end of the day, I would say that disinformation carried the day with the Kenyan election. Just do a simple Google search today about the Kenyan election, and you will find numerous articles, numerous documentaries that have been produced on misinfo and disinfo in relation to the Kenyan election. And so, the big question now is, what can journalists really do? I feel like we did what is possibly what was in our power, which is to fact check, which was to create content to counter the misinfo and disinfo. But unless the issue of trust can be dealt with within a society, trust in media, trust in institution, I feel like we'll constantly be in a reactive mode as journalists. So I think I'll leave it there, Vivian, and I'm really keen to hear what my co-panelists have to say about this, and yeah, perhaps find more solutions from other parts of the world.
Thank you so much, Asha, and you've raised several themes that I think will continue to come up over the course of this conversation. The role of so-called influencers for hire, and the rise of TikTok, which even to the extent that other social media platforms are not as accountable as we would like them to be, TikTok even less so, and the issue of trust, which we're definitely going to come back to. I want to now turn it over to you, Metta. You also, this is case study number 2. We talked about the presidential elections and the information disorder there. Your work has focused a great deal on COVID mis and disinformation, and then when the vaccines came along, the impact and the misinformation about vaccines, also forming a collective. So tell us a little bit about what was happening, what has been happening in Indonesia and your work there.
Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. I think what happened in Indonesia actually is quite similar with Drew and Asha mentioned, related to COVID-19 issue and related to political issue, especially with presidential elections and regional head elections in Indonesia. But I just want to say about the situation in developing countries like Indonesia. It's not easy to combat hoax and disinformation. Why? Because the internet penetration in Indonesia, for example, is growing rapidly, in very, very fast. In total, total population Indonesia now is around 275 million people, and 70% of them has been connected with internet. But unfortunately, according to survey, 60% of internet users in Indonesia believing in hoax. So that's why we have
Say that percent one more time.
60%. 60%
60%.
of total internet users in Indonesia believing in hoax, disinformation, misinformations. That's why we have homework to deal with hoax and disinformation. And maybe I can share a little bit about my experience in dealing with COVID-19 issues and presidential election issues. But regarding combating hoax in COVID-19, I want to share my experience when we initiate and coordinating various media organization in Indonesia to make a collaborative and collective action in combating hoax and disinformation. We called it as a media lawan COVID in bahasa Indonesia, or media against COVID-19. This is actually a collective action among initially 50 media all over Indonesia, and then could be expanded around 100 media to make educational content about all about COVID-19. Why this is important? Because educational content in Indonesia, it's very, very important for people, for poor people especially. Because at that time, it's funny, Indonesia government not really believe about the COVID-19 virus. At that time, Health Minister of Indonesia said that COVID-19, COVID virus is not real. And then
The government said that.
yeah, the government, the health minister, the former health minister.
Excellent.
You can imagine. And he suggests that, okay, people just enough to pray, and then drinking traditional herb medicine, and then eating more broccoli. And then another minister was also still argue that the virus cannot survive in the tropical countries like Indonesia. So this is misinformation and comes from the government. I think it's very dangerous for public. That's why we try to make a cooperative action, collaboration action among media. The second one, another experience that I want to share in dealing with hoax and disinformation, when my company Katadata work on project of debunking hoax on COVID-19 vaccine, especially about COVID-19 vaccine among traditional market merchants. The program was conducted actually for 1 year, 2021-2022, and focusing to improve the market merchants' trust and confidence in COVID-19 vaccine. And finally, we hope they could participate in COVID-19 vaccinations. Why we try to do this effort? And actually, this is a part of Google News Initiative project. Actually, at that time, Katadata with 10 media companies from other countries join in this effort to combat misinformation vaccine. And at that time, we try to make partnership with association of traditional wet market merchants all over Indonesia. This effort was crucial because the massive hoax has hampered vaccination program in Indonesia at that time. according to survey conducted by Katadata Insight Center, this is a unit, research unit in Katadata. At that time, about 52% respondents were not willing to vaccinate it, were not willing to get vaccine, and only about 27% are eager to be vaccinated. So very low.
Just out of curiosity,
percentage.
what did the health minister have to say about the COVID vaccine?
Yeah, maybe you can believe that health minister don't believe about COVID, and they don't push about the vaccination. Fortunately, the President Jokowi finally replaced health minister with the new health minister, and I think after the replacement, the progress is quite much better than before. And then the other effort that we make related to political field, maybe I can share a little bit. Besides hoax on COVID-19, Indonesia also face a big problem with the proliferation of hoax and disinformation in the political field, especially in the presidential election and regional head elections, Jakarta governor elections. This bad experience occurred in 2014 and 2019 presidential election, and then at that time hoax deeply penetrated Indonesian political discourse, and many politicians play identity politics at that time based on religious and radical issues. For example, President Jokowi, the current president of Indonesia, at that time was attacked by rumors that he was anti-Muslim and his family had ties to the Indonesian Communist Party or PKI. It was a very sensitive issue in Indonesia because Communist Party was banned in Indonesia since 1965. And don't forget that Indonesia is the biggest Muslim country in the world. So when opposition built disinformation with the issue related to religion, I think it's very dangerous for any political party or any presidential candidate. And then the second example, when the Jakarta governor election was held in 2016, incumbent Governor Basuki Cahayapurnama at that time was attacked with rumors that he had insulted Islam. Basuki Purnama is a Chinese descent and a Christian, so he was finally imprisoned for 2 years on charge of blasphemy. This is the situation that facing in Indonesia about disinformation and misinformation.
Okay, thank you for sharing those stories, and I think we and everybody in the room has seeing the incredible explosion rise, the kind of adjectives, Drew, that you mentioned. But look, let's get real. Lying politicians is not new. Mis and disinformation is not new, and yet we're living in unprecedented times. So what factor has changed? What factor has changed is the ability for information to be spread and gamed on our devices via social media platforms. So I want to turn to you, Jeff, given your deep expertise both about Metta as a company, which includes, of course, both Facebook and WhatsApp, but also speak a little bit, if you can, about the YouTube and TikTok and their role in mis and disinformation today.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of similarities, and just to begin with, for the other panelists that are dealing with this internationally, I think something just is a good thing to anyone who is from the US or Europe to be reminded of is that whatever you might think the problems of social media are, they are a hell of a lot worse in both of these markets for two reasons. First of all, just the policing resources that get put into them, the ability of the platforms to even understand the languages being spoken, even in some instances primary languages. is low. And the second reason is, I think, as was noted, the rapid onboarding of vast populations of people who have never previously had access to the internet before. I think we have taken for granted, given how bad we consider our own issues with information quality to be, that functionally 2 decades of wide access to the internet in some ways inoculated us to some of the worst and most awful stuff in terms of susceptibility. So inside of Facebook, some of the research that we got our hands on was related to, I believe they called them, low information users? And the idea is that a third of the US and essentially a higher portion of overseas populations are pretty unable to deal with like even the most basic, what we would consider to be basic sort of understanding of what this material is and how to deal with it. So like you take in India, for example, if you took a static picture and added music to it, people would think it was a video, and a video is by definition true. Like that sort of thing would be, and this isn't that the Indians are dumb, this is just that people are very new to the internet and very new to and there's not much else guidance. So in terms of what, and I'm kind of channeling here from the internal Metta sources that I've been dealing with, what works and what doesn't. The platforms have spoken a lot about counter-speech, and to some degree fact-checking is an exercise in counter-speech. Counter-speech on its own does not work. If the goal is to say, if one person's position is, we'll use the Queen of England today, that the Queen of England managed to live to the ripe age of 96 because she harvested adrenochrome from tortured children, which is like a QAnon staple. Arguing with that person on a social media platform or writing up an article is not helpful. First of all, because total bullshit combined with someone noting that it's total bullshit does not add up to anything useful in the conversation. The second thing is that the people spreading that stuff, and this is because this is very much a network game. One, they've got more attractive material than you do. Hearing about the Queen of England torturing children is a lot more fun than the story of how the Queen of England does not in fact torture children, right? It's just, we have less interesting material. And then two, they are also going to be on the platform when you log off, because you will eventually log off because the Queen of England torturing children is not in fact the center of your life. But for them it is, and they are going to win that argument simply through sheer persistence. So I think there's been kind of an effort to, I don't want to say that now that fact-checking and that there isn't some element of correcting things, but I think the combating framework has been perhaps overplayed, right? One does not get to combat misinformation because you don't get to choose the fight. You get to wrestle with a pig. And I think that a lot of times in our industry, we have made mistakes in which the communities in which the most insane junk tends to spread really love having a foil. And if that's that, some extremely lame mainstream journalistic outlet is, calling bullshit on what they are saying, that's all the more proof. This is fun, right? So I think, I don't want to say that there's not value to fact checking. One way that there is certainly value, and I think that you mentioned the Google News element, I don't think Google's very transparent about how it does this. Facebook is a little more transparent, but the systems themselves do a lot of control. If you all remember, our original exposure to fake news as a concept was post-2016, the fake news publishers, the Macedonians, etc. Those publishers don't exist. Facebook, Meta killed them. It took about a year and a half. These straight fake news publishers. What arose afterward, which is harder, and which Meta was also very much more reluctant to combat because the area was a little bit more gray, was more partisan, less straight false, right? So saying, publications that just literally just made crap up, that ceased being a viable business model. And one of the reasons that became that way is because Facebook began using fact checks and its fact checking partners to just de-amplify So if, as soon as a fact check came through from one of their partners, they would just murder the distribution. And that particular thing would, if the systems worked well, and that, trust me, internally that is quite an if, would slow the distribution and prevent it from catching on. So that's a valuable thing. Obviously, it's out of our control. I think if I were running a fact-checking organization, I would be very focused on trying to build partnerships with any platform I could and to pressure / leverage / twist arm / extort them into the partnerships that both provide money and also in some ways amplify the signal of fact checkers that are doing it. But then beyond that, I think the reference to in the Kenyan election, the idea that there needs to be a coalition and a network is extremely important because the way this material spreads is via network. And if you are, I think we've long had in our industry a sense that because we are the ones saying something, that is the evidence that it is true. And that actually was tenable so long as there was not a massive crowd that also had microphones. But at this point, we can't do that. So it's very important to be linking to other work. I think the idea of writing up your own debunk is fine, but to some degree, you got to be careful that you're not just riding the coattail of the crazy thing, which I think is frequently, if you look at which gets more distribution, the fact checked or the crazy thing, it's usually not the fact check. So you sort of put together the information that you can and then find partners that are able to ideally amplify and also just understand that you are not going to be able to reach people. I think one of the things that internally Facebook discovered was that sharing false information does not necessarily indicate a belief in false information. It frequently does, and certainly the broader it spreads, the more people believe. It's more of a issue of loyalty, community loyalty, and people have chosen their selected community, and whether or not there are microchips in vaccines, obviously no, isn't necessarily. It's not that anyone feels like the argument for microchips in vaccines is particularly compelling. It's just that is what their community is saying, and so they're going to spread it. So I think the civil society issues that both of these other panelists are talking about are very relevant.
So you've painted a somewhat dark picture. Well, everybody on this panel has. But I do want to say I'm glad you pointed out, because I also believe this is true. It's not that the platforms are generally completely ignoring these issues. There has been progress, but what you've described is that the news organizations themselves, the notion of fact-checking or debunking by itself is not that useful. So other than extorting the platforms, which I'm all for, is what can individual journalists or news organizations, is there anything that we can do that does move the needle? For instance, there's now a movement towards the concept of pre-bunks or other forms, other actions that can begin to inoculate the population against being predisposed to believe something that's bullshit.
So I'd be interested in what some of the other panelists have to say on this in terms of what's actually worked for them, but the things that seem to be valuable, at least, and this is again based on the internal Facebook work, is obviously one, if you can get signal inside the companies, that's valuable. Two, I think the pre-bunking idea is an interesting one, but I think the table stakes for sort of good journalism on this stuff, if it's just sort of one out of context thing where you're saying, no, it's not, I don't think that adds up to much. I think what you need to be able to demonstrate to people is the path that information is taking. So if you can identify basically entities that are persistently pushing particular threads that are bullshit, then that is a fantastic thing to do, and to demonstrate how basically one nerve center manages to spread that. That's important. I think another important thing to do is to look and see the interfaces between platforms. So if you see, again, because of the US in 2016, we kind of got the sense that disinformation was a kind of a thing that foreigners imposed on us. That is not generally the case. So if you can look and see basically how things jump from one platform to the next, like most of the misinformation on Facebook does not originate on Facebook. It is, and who is sort of bringing it in. And then also, I think this is very important for us, like looking at how it is jumping into mainstream channels. In the US in 2020, post-2020 election, I think our industry loved to focus on the role of social media. It did not love to focus on how, say, those things hopped into wide discussion. Because I think, saying, oh, it's, let's hear both sides on this is, of course, the absolute worst thing you can do. And we regularly still do that, in part because, again, this is good content. It's like, I think that people like wrestling with pigs for that reason. If we're looking for clicks, which we sometimes are institutionally, it helps.
Yeah, well, there's a whole other panel to do about the way that news organizations and particularly broadcast media do both sides things that should not be both-sided. So I want to just ask another round of questions, just change the topic a little bit before we go to questions, which is the impact of mis and disinformation on you all personally as journalists, because we know that one of the tools, one of the greatest weapons that the bad guys have is to attack the journalists and undermine the trust and credibility of reporting. Drew, I want to just start briefly with you. If you maybe just have a couple of, you knew this was coming, I saw you shuffling your pages. Just a couple of statistics from your survey about how journalists felt about their own sort of safety online and off, frankly.
Clearly, the nexus between disinformation and the online and physical safety of journalists who work either just in their ordinary work or especially, of course, in their efforts to counter disinformation also came through loud and clear in our survey. 65% of our respondents said that they had faced hostility from the public. 41% said they had received threats by email or phone. 22% said they'd been harassed in person. 21% said they had been trolled online. 15% said they had added personal security precautions to their routines. So clearly, this is an enormous part of what the experience of being a journalist in a disinformation flood is. And of course, this is in the U.S. with a range of structural supports that are available. So this, I think that, we have, Pan America has done a lot of work in the area of online defense within newsrooms, and I think the impact on journalists themselves and their ability to stand as that bulwark that we need as part of the set of equations, a set of of responses that we formulate can't be underestimated.
Thank you, and I'm glad you pointed out that in the United States we have greater protections, although even those are not certainly not foolproof, as we saw in Las Vegas the other day with the murder of the investigative reporter. Asha, you obviously are doing heroic work in Kenya, trying to with other news organizations trying to debunk false claims. How has that affected you personally? What do you have to deal with on a personal level?
Thanks, Vivian, for that question. I think leading an organization and working especially with younger journalists who don't have a lot of experience, misinfo, disinfo is sort of like a battle every single day. But I think there's even a bigger, it poses a bigger crisis in countries like Kenya, because when the US president called American media fake news, politicians on our side sort of like mirrored those, that approach and called media on this side fake news. And so it's much harder when you go online and you're not just trying to fact check, but you're also trying to report the news. You're trying to report what's going on in the country. and then being branded as fake news, that does something to newsrooms. It's we've seen the deterioration of trust in media in Kenya because of that, and then because of this flurry of disinfo, and because of sort of like literacy levels when it comes to misinformation. That's one of the approaches actually that we are taking, is that to try and teach audiences that this is misinformation, like, just the basics, like this is misinformation. If you see things reported this way, or if you see things amplified this way, be careful, do not forward. Just because, it's led to the deterioration of trust, which has affected newsrooms being able to sustain themselves, which has led to reporters being fired. It's just like, it's a domino effect. But I'd like to really add my voice to something that Jeff was speaking about, which is what can we do? I know that, my contribution initially about the Kenyan election painted a very grim picture, but there's some nuance to it. It was very different this year because, number one, look at the election results in Kenya. The two contenders, there were about 80,000 votes between them. The other thing is that a third of the voters didn't vote, right? I think that misinfo and disinfo thrives in situations where societies are polarized, where there's no trust. But then this time around, there was something that unified all Kenyans, no matter your political stance, no matter your ethnicity, no matter your personal beliefs, and that is the state of the economy. Kenya is wallowing in public debt. People are feeling the pinch. Prices are expensive. The effects of the Ukraine war are being felt. And so it didn't matter what you thought about the politician that you were supporting. The reality for every single Kenyan was that you go to the supermarket and you can't afford to shop, or you have to downgrade your lifestyle. You can't make rent. There are no jobs. People have lost their jobs. And that sort of made people step back. And even though there were these disinfo campaigns online, we also saw audiences now sort of like asking themselves, what's the bigger picture here? So that created an opportunity for us as journalists and as the collective to get in between and tell people, yes, this is what we've been trying to say. This is misinformation. It happened during COVID. It happened during the other elections, and it's happening now. And I think that there's something that we sort of cracked because people are now a little bit more aware. Certainly the people who have been able to see, sort of like the literacy campaigns. And I think this is one good approach. The second thing is the platforms. I know for the developed world, this is sort of like it's a point that's been made over and over again, but addressing the platforms is very urgent in a context like Kenya's. Funny enough, with the collective, one of the things that we were doing is that we were flagging some of these very concerning campaigns that we were seeing. The most responsive platform was actually TikTok. TikTok went and pulled down more than 2 million videos that had been produced, with incitement on their platform. And then they also added links to some of the work that the collective was doing. A platform like Metta, for instance, barely wanted to give us audience, right? Twitter, we told Twitter that, look, during the American campaign, you went even ahead to fact check the president. And even during COVID, you were fact checking certain accounts that were problematic. They weren't able to do that for Kenya. And yet it was accounts that were problematic, accounts that were leading these disinformation campaigns could be easily identified. And so I think there's a bigger conversation about things that can be done immediately to address this issue, and that can go a really long way in contexts like Kenya's.
Thank you so much, Asha. We're really running out of time, so Metta, just very briefly, if you don't mind, I did want to give you an opportunity to speak about the personal impact that you've had in terms of your reporting on being people targeting you.
Yeah, okay. I just want to emphasize that how important to prioritize to protect journalists and fact checkers teams in combating hoax and disinformation. Why? Because I personally have a very bad experience when I investigate one big case related to tax fraud scandal in Indonesia. I investigate this case in 2006 to 2007, and the tax fraud related to the biggest palm oil company in Indonesia, Asian Agri Group. This company owned by Sukanto Tanoto. He is the richest person in Indonesia 2004, 2006, I think, according to Forbes magazine. And unfortunately, he also philanthropist and donate $100 million to several universities in the United States. For example, to Wharton, and then to MIT. And he awarded Dean Medals from Wharton. He's a very, very well-known person in Indonesia, but he also doing tax fraud in Indonesia. But at that time, when I investigate, he can doing anything to pressure journalists like me. At that time, he hired Pinkerton, one of the biggest investigative private investigator from US, to spy me and my family. And then they could ask the police to tape my cell phone, and then all text messages from my cell phone taped by the police, and then circulated to parliament, to media, to public. And at that time, if my office not offends me, maybe I was in jail now. So I think it's very, very important to protect journalists when we combat hoax, disinformation, because finally it could be treated physically. I think this is maybe I want to emphasize about how important to protect journalists.
Yeah. Thank you. The repercussions of mis and disinformation are very real. We're going to have time just for 2 questions. Sorry about that. So over here, if you could just put your hand up all the way over here. Yeah.
Thank you. Good morning. I'm Professor of Akim Feleye from the University of Lagos, Nigeria, trained at Missouri School of Journalism. I've heard the interesting story from Kenya. Nigeria, the most populous nation in Africa, we have our election in February 2023. Next week, campaign will commence. And one of the presenters says that we need training. Just wondering what type of training can we give to our gay students vis-a-vis how to cope with the challenges of these information traffickers. I call them information traffickers. Last election, we can see social media, see what thou art done to us. We don't want a repeat of that this year. Can you let us know whether you can ban or regulate fake news? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So from your experiences, and would say to Asha or Metta and Drew, you might from Penn have some experience here. What are the best ways to help prepare trained journalists to combat this kind of campaigns? Asha, I'll turn to you. Where did you turn to know what to do, and how did you help the journalists and your young journalists, particularly in your network?
First, I think this is the same in Nigeria, but in Kenya, there are many institutions that help train fact checkers. And so what the collective did was just to amplify that training. One of the things that was happening was that there were more newbie reporters even in mainstream media houses, where you had more than 60% of the reporters were covering their first election. Just because of everything that had happened, newsrooms having to sort of like cut their payrolls. And so we trained reporters on fact checking. We partnered with organizations. I think Nigeria also has a lot of organizations like, Africa Check. That was one of the main ones that was conducting the training. But another element that was also interesting was that these trainings were also taken to communities. So, we went to informal settlements and trained audiences on fact-checking. So fact-checking shouldn't be a reserve for journalists. And I think, I found that really interesting, and seeing, mothers and young people in informal settlements just receiving this training really well and saying, I didn't even know that, there's a link there's a website you could go to and just check whether a photograph is legit or doctored. So I think that's what I would say for my brother, to my brother from Nigeria. I think the tactics will be very similar. When we look at the Nigerian campaigns right now, we're seeing, we can draw similarities to the Kenyan election. And I think perhaps the Kenyan context can be a big lesson for those of you preparing to cover the election in 2023 in Nigeria.
Great, thank you. One more question. I thought I saw maybe a hand up over here. Oh, yeah, there you are. Okay.
I'm in the blind spot. Sorry. Good morning. Jan Lublinski. I work for DW Academy, Germany's big organization for media development. So we run in a large number of countries programs against disinformation. We're become more careful about fact-checking, but we still think it's one element, and media literacy. And I'm thinking a lot about pre-bunking at the moment, and I wonder if Jeff and the other panelists could maybe say what they think about different pre-bunking approaches. More specifically, well, just to give you one example for the discussion, my Ukraine country team tells us that in Ukraine people were somehow vaccinated against the propaganda coming from Putin because they knew this was coming. So people did not take everything that was suddenly spilled over them. And my specific question is, how do you see the technological potential, Jeff, for analyzing what is coming up in the social media so that the newsrooms can see the topics that might come up so they can be prepared for whatever comes, and then maybe even vaccinate people early on? Do you think that's realistic to work towards such a direction?
So in terms of just trying to pay attention to what's coming up, obviously Facebook's internal tool, CrowdTangle, which is increasingly hard to access because the company has perhaps understandably decided that paying attention to virality is something that it does not want the outside world to be able to do, given the nature of content on its platform. I don't know that I feel like, I think it's good to have the pre-bunking type stuff out there just so it can be quickly referenced. But again, thinking about this as a network issue, there is absolutely no way that you're going to be able to, first of all, foresee the specific thing that is going to be lied about. I mean, obviously, in Indonesia, it sounds like there is going to be a very good chance that someone is going to get called anti-Muslim in the context of any election. So, that's a good thing to be aware of. But, I don't think the actual information itself matters that much. It could be anything, right? Like if one particular thing doesn't work, then they'll just move on to the next one. I would argue that the reason why Ukraine is remarkably resilient to Russian propaganda is because they are attempting to speak to a community. The Russians are attempting to speak to a community that is really not into the concept of Russian propaganda, right? There's an identity there that is very fiercely opposed to anything that could possibly be considered pro-Russian, or and I think a wariness in particular about information that might potentially be Russian, right? So it's in the same way that if, say, I try to write something, correcting anti-vaccination stuff in an anti-vax group on Facebook, they're pretty well inoculated against that themselves, if that makes sense, and they're inoculated by communities. So I think you have to figure out what communities can be reached through channels, through the networks that they already have. That's your best shot, because you can't cross those sort of polarized boundaries with information. It doesn't work.
I think that is, I'm afraid, all the time that we have. But thank you so much to all the panelists. Asha, thank you for joining us from Kenya. And I'm turning it over to you now, Jackie.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you.